Dear everyone, welcome to Master Merve Akça's doctoral disputation on this Friday, November the 25th, 2022. On May the 27th, 2022, Merve Akça submitted a thesis entitled Attending to Sounds in the Blink of an Eye and requested permission to present it for the degree of philosophiae doctor of this university. On the recommendation of the Department of Musicology, the Faculty of Humanities appointed the following evaluation committee. Professor Marie Tervaniemi from the University of Helsinki, Professor Pascal Belin from Aix-Marseille University, and Professor Alexander Repsum Jensenius from the University of Oslo. Professor Jensenius served as the coordinator of the committee. On September the 6th, the evaluation committee reported that it had found the thesis worthy of being defended at a doctoral disputation for the degree of philosophiae doctor. The candidate will now give a prescribed trial lecture on the following topic: attention to sounds, theoretical frameworks, and applied perspectives in music psychology. I now call upon the doctoral candidate, Merve Akça, to come forward and give her lecture. The floor and the screen are yours.
Thanks, Zafer. Hello, everyone. So, welcome, everyone who is here physically or joining online to today's trial lecture on attention to sounds, theoretical frameworks, and applied perspectives in music psychology. In the next 45 minutes, I'll try to sketch out some of the general principles of attention in the auditory domain through addressing the theoretical and applied perspectives on this topic. We live in a multimodal world with incoming information from all our senses, but this trial lecture is primarily about one modality, namely audition. As an invitation for you to start thinking more in this sensory modality, I'll start this lecture with a quote from John Pearce, and if you're willing, you may close your eyes and listen while I read this quote to you. Imagine stepping down from the porch of your country home on a moonless autumn night. A breeze stirs the remaining leaves of the maple tree above you. Disturbed by your footfalls, some tiny creature rustles in the leaves on the ground. In the distance, you hear a car, and from the sound it makes, you judge that it is not a new car. It turns in at your driveway. You can't really see it. You're blinded by the glare of the headlights, but you hear the crunch of the gravel as it approaches. The car pulls to a stop. You hear a door open. "Hi, John," a voice says. "Hi, Mark," you reply. "Long time no see." Yeah. You may open your eyes now if you haven't already. So as you see from this example, audition plays a key role in interpreting the world around us. But sounds are everywhere. But how do we attend to sounds? How do theorists and applied researchers think about auditory attention in humans? Before we start answering these questions, let's have a look at today's lecture's outline. In the first and the largest part of this lecture, I'll talk about attention to speech and music, covering the early theories of attention chronologically, as well as some of the classical paradigms and examples of how these were applied in experiments with speech and music. Then I'll introduce you to two interesting attention phenomena, showing how attention is limited. I'll then briefly talk about how brain response to sounds inform us in attention research. And finally, I'll show how the knowledge of auditory attention can be applied in various contexts in everyday life. So here I'll focus on speech and music, and this is because both speech and music processing are inherently connected to various aspects of cognition, including attention, memory, perception, and emotion. So auditory attention studies started in the early 1950s in an attempt to understand why air traffic controllers sometimes fail to perceive messages presented over the headphones, even though they were perfectly audible. Why is this important? Air traffic controllers have a job that relies heavily on attention. They have to deal with a multitude of signals simultaneously. A mistake in this context can have high consequences. Donald Broadbent, one of the pioneers in cognitive and applied psychology, was interested in understanding the attention processes through creating experiments that resembled this. Aside from being the first modern psychologist to study the nature of auditory attention, he was trained as a pilot and joined the British Royal Army during World War II. The study of attention rapidly grew following his publication of Perception and Communication in 1958. Despite the theoretical focus of the psychologists of his time, he also wanted to solve practical problems through combining theoretical concepts to broaden the understanding in real-life situations. In his studies, he used a technique known as dichotic listening. And before I go deeper into Broadbent's theoretical view on attention, I'll first explain what dichotic attention is. So dichotic listening involves presenting two auditory messages simultaneously, one to each ear. This technique was also used by Colin Cherry, professor of telecommunication in Imperial College in London. Cherry asked his participants to do a so-called shadowing task, meaning that he asked participants to shadow or verbally report back only one of these messages. What he found was, well, first of all, this was a fairly easy thing to do. Second, he discovered that people could report almost nothing about the content of the ignored message. He observed that while certain properties, for example, pitch changes, are noticed, the language, for example, a switch from English to German, as well as the semantic content, went unnoticed. Cherry also asked, in crowded social situations, how do we manage to attend to what one person is saying while many are speaking at the same time? He named this cocktail party problem. Informed by these and other initial studies of auditory attention, several attention theories were proposed. Broadbent's theory was the first systematic attempt to answer these early findings. At the heart of these theories was what is known as the early-late selection debate, which concerned with whether attention operates at an early perceptual stage or a late post-perceptual stage. Broadbent proposed a filter theory, which is an early selection model of attention. This theory postulates that attention is a result of a single limited capacity information processing system. So in order to cope with the flood of information happening in parallel, the system has to operate like a selective filter, meaning that it only lets through some basic distinguishing sensory features to be processed. For example, pitch, location, intensity, and so on. After this filtering out, we can extract semantics of an information, for example, meaning of a spoken word. The response output comes after this. The theory assumes that the non-shadowed message in the unattended channel should not be subject to any higher level processing. Opposing to this view, Mori showed that when the participant's own name is presented in the unattended channel, people notice this about 1/3 of the time. Another important observation was that if an important message is presented in the attended ear was switched mid-sentence to the unattended channel, people would shift their attention to follow the message. This was found by Anne Trisman in 1960. So British psychologist Anne Trisman was one of Broadbent's PhD students. She modified the filter theory and suggested that the non-shadowed or unattended message is not filtered out, but instead attenuated. So if a message is not selected based on its physical properties, it is not completely eliminated, but more like as if its volume is lowered down. This way, it can still go through further analysis. She also suggested that important stimuli, for example, those that has biological relevance for us, may preset the attentional switching. This helps explain how people shift to the unattended channel when their own name is mentioned in that channel. Further building on these theories, Deutsch and Deutsch proposed the pertinence model, which was later revised by Norman. This is a late selection model of attention, meaning that it places the attentional filter later in the processing, after all the stimuli have already been analyzed. This theory holds that the selection takes place based on the pertinence of the information. In other words, whatever information carries the highest level of significance is most likely to be selected. The pertinence depends on many top-down factors, including but not limited to context, personal relevance, etc. So far we only saw examples using speech material. Diana Deutsch, a cognitive psychologist who is known for her discoveries of auditory illusions and research in music psychology, later used the dichotic listening method, but to instead present musical information. She reported that when shadowing task was performed with melodies played on a piano, she observed the same effect. That is, the participant had very little to say about the melody in the to-be-ignored channel. She also looked into how sequences of tones were perceived in dichotic listening. As illustrated in the figure on the right, the different tonal sequence was presented to each ear, an ascending scale to one ear and a descending scale to the other. She thus discovered that these kinds of presentations produces paradoxical auditory illusions, which were perceived differently by left and right-handed people. Here's an example of the scale illusion. So when listening this over headphones, most right-handed people hear the stream of the higher tones as emanating from the right ear and the lower tones from the left ear. Fast forward to 2008, researchers used this scale illusion in neglect patients with right hemisphere damage. This type of patients lack conscious awareness of sensory events on their left side. Despite suffering from severe left auditory extinction as a result of this condition, they experienced the illusion, which led to the conclusion that awareness is not necessary for perceptual analysis, which in this case was auditory grouping. In the theories that I've covered up until this point, there was a lack of flexibility. The model proposed by Daniel Kahneman portrays attention to be more flexible. For example, we can perform fine in dichotic listening task, provided that the available attentional capacity is not exceeded. Kahneman viewed attention in terms of capacity. According to him, we have a limited amount of resources or mental effort, and different tasks can have different capacity demands. So this would leave more or less capacity available for performing other tasks. So you can see in the illustration that according to the resource model, there is an allocation policy on the available attentional capacity, meaning that how much effort needs to be allocated depends on factors like arousal, that is the physiological state, enduring dispositions, for example, mention of a name, or intentions, for example, the current goals of the participant, and so on. He also used pupil size as an online index of the mental effort and shown that it correlates closely with mental effort in many different contexts or attentional demands. Kahneman's theory was informed by the dual task experiments. In the dual task experiments, participants are asked to perform two tasks simultaneously. Generally speaking, when two tasks are executed together, performance typically drops in one or both tasks when compared to the performance on a single task. I'll borrow an example from Kahneman, who borrowed it from another psychologist, John Sanders. So imagine that a man is reading a newspaper by the pool while his toddler is engaged in a random crawl in the area. He, and I quote, must adjust his looks away from the newspaper to a frequency which is sufficient to maintain the risk of the baby falling into the pool within acceptable bounds. So, according to Kahneman, some sort of optimization is needed for the limited capacity attentional allocation. For some researchers, dual task performance relates to divided attention, whereas according to others, these kind of situations reflect an attentional shift. The dual task cost can depend on how much the tasks interfere with one another. Also, factors like difficulty, practice, experience, and similarity have been reported to influence the dual task costs. In music, it is common to have one or more independent layers of melodies happening at the same time. This is called polyphony. Are the costs associated with dual task listening somehow become easier in the music domain compared to speech? Several researchers have addressed this question. For example, in a study designed similarly to the shadowing task instead of songs, they observed listeners to encounter similar difficulties in music just as in speech. In a more recent study, Bigand and colleagues simultaneously presented the listeners two familiar nursery tunes and asked them to detect melodic errors. Compared to the detection of the errors when the tunes were played separately, in the simultaneous presentation, the error detection was dramatically lower, even for expert musicians. So could it be possible that these costs arise only when the task requires same kind of analysis? In a classic study, Alport, Antonis, and Reynolds asked pianists to sight read piano pieces while repeating word-by-word speech played over headphones. By the end of 2 sessions of practicing doing these two things together, they could perform these tasks together and alone just as well. The authors suggested that instead of a single attentional bottleneck, there must be several independent processors that operate in parallel. There was one flaw in this argument, because central bottleneck can still be retained if sight reading was automatized. In the late 1970s, Schifrin and Schneider argued that attending can be done automatically, at least with familiar information. They differentiated two forms of information processing, automatic and controlled. Automatic processing is characterized as a fast, parallel, and effortless process that happen without conscious awareness. Controlled processing, on the other hand, is described as slow, generally serial, effortful, and capacity limited. Applying these two terms to explain skilled performance, later Schneider and Fisk referred to the quick, effortless playing of a well-learned pattern of notes by an expert musician as an example of the automatic processing, whereas a novice trying to play a 6-chord sequence would require the person to engage in controlled processing. Schneider and Schifrin also referred to automatic detection as a pop-out effect. As an example of this could be detecting a familiar face in a crowd. Among other things, Schneider and Schifrin's theory has been applied to motor learning in the context of musical skill acquisition, but also in sports sciences. Some cognitive phenomena illustrate really well how attention fails. One of these is called the attentional blink. Discovered by Donald and Margaret Broadbent, later named as attentional blink in analogy to the blink of an eye, this phenomenon shows that we fail to attend temporarily after we successfully attended to something else in a brief temporal window. Since it is discovered and heavily studied in the visual domain, I'll show you how it looks in vision. So basically, you'll see that you're presented a stream of letters, and among which you're asked to report 2 targets. Your first target is in the color white, and your second target is the letter X. So the idea is that when they follow each other closely, if you identified the first target correctly, you typically fail to detect the second target. I'll borrow Marvin Chance's fishing metaphor to explain this a bit further. After all, fishing example fits nicely in the Norwegian context. There are all kinds of stuff. You see in the first image that there are all kinds of stuff in the river, among which there is also fish number 1. You commit to fishing out the first fish. Soon after, a boat drifts by and the fish number 2 also appears in the scene. But because you're your attention is occupied with the first number, fish number 1, you aren't able to fish out the second fish. So the second fish gets away. It may be detected, but is uncollected. I studied this in the auditory modality, and to give you an idea about how it sounds like in the auditory modality, I'll now play an example trial. In this example, the first target was a sine tone, and the second target was a human voice. And you'll hear more about this later today in the introduction of my thesis. Another interesting phenomenon is the inattentional deafness. It shows that attention has an important role in determining awareness. You've probably seen this classic example in the visual modality called the inattentional blindness. And if you haven't, sorry for the spoiler. What happens is that when people are busy counting the ball passes, they fail to notice an unexpected event, such as a man wearing a gorilla suit appearing in the scene. And now let me show you how this is studied in the auditory modality. Of course, we were supposed to have headphones for this, but just to give you an idea.
Hello and welcome to the experiment. The sounds you are about to hear have been recorded in a special way to make them sound amazingly realistic, almost as if they're in the same room as you. In a moment, you'll hear some people preparing for a party. Listen carefully to what the women are saying and try not to be distracted by what the men are saying. Afterwards, you'll be asked a couple of questions about what you heard, so do try to listen carefully.
Hey. Oh, hi Jackie. Hi Charlie.
Hi Jackie. Hi Charlie. How you doing?
I didn't think you'd got it actually.
Yeah, not too
They
bad.
didn't have it in red, so they had to get it in blue. But it looks nice, doesn't it? Better do it around, because I think when's she coming actually? She's coming at 4, so we're gonna yeah. We have got wrapping paper. Yeah, we've got wrapping paper. What colour do you think? I think
Let's do drinks.
we've got silver in this
There's
one.
some cups over here, so I'll come over and give you a hand.
Okay, we'll go with silver. Right.
So I'll tell you what, if I leave these...
It's pretty sharp. Okay, that'll do when it's
So Dalton and Frankel found that 70% of the participants were unable to report the presence of a man saying, "I'm a gorilla," even though it was perfectly audible for 19 seconds. Coremon was first to test this phenomenon in music context, and again, a significant portion of the participants failed to notice an electric guitar solo in the middle of a symphonic poem when they were instructed to count beats. Musicians did better than the non-musicians in noticing the so-called auditory gorilla. In a recent study, researchers used a larger music corpus, and this time they placed animal sounds in familiar pieces. And again, inattentional deafness was observed, although to a lesser degree compared to the previous studies. Also, musicians and non-musicians were equally susceptible to this phenomenon in this study. There are also some behavioral demonstrations of how attention directed to something can leave us deaf to the unattended aspects of the very same scene. So from the behavioral response alone, it was not possible to parse whether these attentional limits reflect our inability to carry out simultaneous events, or we fail to retrieve what we actually observed. With the technological developments in the 1960s, electrophysiological measures of the brain activity allowed researchers to monitor the processing of unattended stimuli as they are presented. There is certainly so much more to this than what I can present in this limited time, but hopefully this will give you some idea of understanding how these kind of measurement tools can also be used to investigate auditory processing and music processing. One commonly employed task is called an oddball paradigm, and in this paradigm, listeners hear infrequent sounds presented, infrequent deviant sounds presented among standard sounds. So in the image, you see beep, 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 bop, beep, beep, bop, beep, bop, and so on. So here the bops are the deviants and the beeps are the standard tones. And usually there is an active listening condition that requires detection of the deviance, and a passive listening condition where participants are instructed to do something else and ignore the sounds. For example, they do other tasks like watching a silent movie or reading a book. At the same time, researchers record electrical activity in the participants' brain in response to the auditory events. They measure something called mismatch negativity, which is a subtraction of brain responses to the standard sounds from the responses to the deviant sounds. Mismatch negativity is generated in the auditory cortex, even when the participants' attention is not directed to the stimuli. In other words, it is an index of the pre-attentive or attention-independent auditory processing. Reviewing the evidence from the mismatch negativity data, Nathan and colleagues suggested that the auditory cortex play a predominant role in many high-level cognitive operations. So mismatch negativity studies have initially explored the physical aspects of sound processing, for example, changes in frequency, timbre, or spatial location. Mismatch negativity studies have also been indispensable for music psychology field. These involved, for example, investigations of processing of musical and speech information, of melodic and rhythmic patterns, as well as long-term musical training effects on pre-attentive auditory processing. Aside from the comparisons of pre-attentive processing of sounds in the larger categories of musicians and non-musicians, in a recent study, Tervaniemi and colleagues found that mismatched negativity responses differentiate the strength of the automatic brain responses based on musicians' trained genre. Another theorist, Marie Strons and colleagues, proposed that listeners dynamically allocate attentional resources over time. The idea is that attention fluctuates rhythmically in predictable pulses. So when the tones are presented at a regular rhythm, the processing of the upcoming sound will be facilitated through rhythmically entrained attentional oscillations. In this theory, the term attentional rhythm is used synonymously with oscillator, which means periodic regularity. So according to this theory, two mechanisms contribute to selection: synchrony and listeners' voluntary heightening of the amplitude of a particularly driven rhythm. This theory has gained popularity among neuroscientists as it conceptually fits with the idea of rhythmic oscillations in the brain, or neural entrainment. Lately, the dynamic properties of listening are becoming more prominent, and so it also has high relevance to topics such as attending to musical rhythm, expectation, and temporal predictions. Moving on to the final part of this trial lecture, which is about the applied perspectives in various settings. As we saw at the beginning of this trial lecture, the formal study of auditory attention was related to solving real-life problems from the get-go. In the rest of the lecture, I'll talk about some of the applied perspectives of this study of auditory attention in an interdisciplinary sense, informed by, among others, music and cognitive psychology. So, in the clinical context, there are many music therapy interventions developed specifically for cognitive rehabilitation. These involve cognitive training techniques covering 4 areas: attention, auditory perception and sensory integration, memory, and executive functions. As you can see in this list, there are many training techniques used in music to aid in these 4 areas. And these are musical sensory orientation training, musical attention control training, musical neglect training, auditory perception training, musical mnemonic training, associative mood and memory training, and musical executive function training. An example for how these are applied in the music therapy for attending to sounds could be to create a cue that to respond for the client. So the cue can be defined in various ways. For example, it can be a rhythmic cue, a melodic cue, harmonic cue, or anything really. So when the cue appears, the client should respond with an action. So every time you hear something, then you are supposed to clap your hand, for example. And there are also other potential clinical applications, and these can include, but not limited to, speech and early language development, dyslexia, aging, Alzheimer's disease, and so on. In addition, with the use of mismatch negativity, it can also be used in monitoring patients in coma state. In the context of education and special needs education, attention research is important because of its central role in learning. In addition, much research has addressed the question of what impact does background music have on task performance. Generally speaking, these findings seem to be contradictory. As shown in the diagram based on Susan Hallam's model, to really understand these contradictory findings, one should systematically look into several potential mediating factors. For example, what's in the background music, what's in the task, the nature of the task, the difficulty of the task, what is the behavioral goal, how is the environment without music, what are the characteristics of the individual, and most importantly, how do these factors interact? In my opinion, the future research on the impact of background music in educational context, or any context for that matter, can also benefit from the theoretical grounding from attention research. Dual task nature of this question is obviously relevant. The interactions of the arousal state induced by music or otherwise present in the current state of the individual, the attentional resources demanded by the task are at the heart of this applied research question. Another application field for attending to sounds is marketing. This is relevant in this context not only because of the role of attention in decision making, but also the power of sound in engaging customers' senses. Indeed, researchers in this field have been looking into how sounds influence marketing and consumer behavior. Among other things, they use sounds to attract attention, to communicate with the customer, for their message to be remembered better, for their brand recognition, or to create a multi-sensory experience. Researchers in the field of sensory marketing know the sound is a crucial part of the product experience. The image you see on the right is a visual ad, yes, but it still becomes a multi-sensory experience because it plays so well with our auditory imagery that it's hard to not hear the sound in the mind's ear. You may have also heard Zampini and Spence's research showing how the sound of a crunch may influence the perception of the potato chips' staleness or crispness. And again, background music is relevant in this applied field as well. For example, when does the background music become a distraction from the ad's message? Auditory attention research and theories could be applied in this context to answer questions like, for example, how much attentional resources do the customer need to devote to understand the brand's message? So to summarize, attention as a selective cognitive process has been studied with sounds since the early 50s and has aimed to solve real-life problems from the get-go. Music and speech processing are inherently related to the study of attention. There are many theories, in fact more than I have covered in this trial lecture, that explain how we attend to sounds. Early debates and theories were centered around the location of a processing bottleneck. Attention theories have provided many rich concepts. These include automaticity, awareness, interference, multitasking, effort, and many more. They also provided new research directions. Dynamic events, such as listening to music, have had a predominant role in newer influential theories. Many applications of these theoretical constructs is possible, for example, in music and language domains, but also in clinical, educational, and commercial contexts. Thank you.
I would like to thank the candidate for her trial lecture. We will now take a break of 1 hour and 15 minutes and continue with the disputation at 12:15. Have a nice break. Dear everyone, welcome to Master Merve Akça's doctoral disputation on this Friday, November the 25th, 2022. And welcome back those who were here earlier today. On May the 27th, 2022, Merve Akça submitted a thesis entitled Attending to Sounds in the Blink of an Eye, and requested permission to present it for the degree of philosophiae doctor of this university. On the recommendation of the Department of Musicology, the Faculty of Humanities appointed the following evaluation committee. Professor Marie Tervaniemi, University of Helsinki, Professor Pascal Belin, ex-Marseille University, and Professor Alexander Jensenius from the University of Oslo. Professor Jensenius served as the coordinator of the committee. On September the 6th, the evaluation committee reported that it had found the thesis worthy of being defended at a doctoral disputation for the degree of philosophiae doctor. Earlier today, the candidate gave a prescribed trial lecture on the following topic: attention to sounds, theoretical frameworks, and applied perspectives in music psychology. The trial lecture has been found satisfactory by the evaluation committee. Now the candidate is to defend her thesis in public. The first opponent in the disputation will be Professor Marie Tervaniemi, and the second opponent, Professor Pascal Belin. If anyone either present here in the room or online wishes to speak as an opponent ex auditorio, they should let us know before the second ordinary opponent is called upon to speak. May I kindly ask the audience to please turn off your mobile phones, or at least put them in silent mode. I now call upon the doctoral candidate, Merve Akça, to come forward and give her introduction.
Thanks, Zafer. Welcome back. My doctoral thesis is titled as Attending to Sounds in the Blink of an Eye. It is about the limits of temporal selective auditory attention and perception. In particular, this is an investigation of the potential modulations of these limits. In this brief introduction, I will unpack what I mean by these and summarize my thesis. The problem is there is too much information in our environment for everything to be attended. Even if we were to focus only on one sensory modality, the problem is complicated. As a consequence, information processing has to be selective. Attention is subject to spatial and temporal constraints, meaning that our attentional system doesn't enable us to attend to all sources of information at all locations or at all times. In my thesis, I focused exclusively on the temporal constraints. So my thesis is concerned with two overarching questions. First is, what are these constraints in audition? And the second is, can we modulate them? The main objectives of my thesis were to investigate potential modulations of these temporal limits through stimulus-related factors, and the second objective was to shed light onto the complex relationship between the temporal limits of human auditory cognition and participant-related factors. I'll start by presenting some of what we knew before the investigations in my thesis. First of all, we knew that there are several experimental demonstrations to illustrate attentional limits. In the trial lecture, we saw a classic example of how people miss detecting a person even dressed as a gorilla during a counting task. We also know ways to study temporal attentional limits. In particular, this thesis used two classic paradigms of cognitive psychology, namely rapid serial presentation paradigm and attentional blink task. Rapid serial presentation paradigm is an experimental procedure which involves a stream of stimuli presented at the same location at a rapid rate. It is used to measure how fast can the information be presented and still allow to reliably detect a target stimuli. It is common to use this paradigm in vision, and it is also possible to use it in the auditory modality, and that's what I did in my thesis. This thesis also employs an attentional blink task. Attentional blink, as we saw, is not an actual eye blink. It is a cognitive phenomenon that is named in analogy to the blink of an eye, as in the title of my thesis as well. This phenomenon suggests that when people are presented with a rapid stream of information and were to report two targets in the stream, they usually fail to report the presence of the second target if the first target closely follows the other one, and given that the first one was correctly identified. So I showed you this already in the trial lecture, but here's another quick run through. If the first target marked in white was catched, and the second target, which was an X, closely follows, people usually miss noticing the second target. The phenomenon was first discovered in vision, and it is heavily studied in this sensory modality. The attentional blink has been thought to be a robust universal limitation of human cognition. But was it really so? A little while back, some counterintuitive findings started to emerge in the visual modality. I summarized these in one of the background chapters in my thesis under three categories: the tasks that we blink less to, stimuli we blink less to, and individuals who do not blink or blink less. Let me give you some examples from the last two categories, as these have more relevance to my thesis. In the trial lecture, we have seen how certain stimuli have privilege in accessing attention, thus surpassing the structural limits. For example, early theorists observed that participants' own name could pass through the unattended channel. Shapiro found that personal names can also escape the attentional blink effect, meaning that when personal names were used as the second target, participants didn't show the attentional blink effect. Others have reported either attenuation or removal of the attentional blink for human faces as well as for objects of expertise, such as cars for car experts. Researchers in vision have also found that there is a small group of individuals who do not show this effect. They call them the non-blinkers. It seems like these individuals consolidate information into working memory faster, inhibit irrelevant information better, and allocate their attention to critical information faster. Although relative to vision, there is a limited number of investigations in the auditory modality, we also knew that there are some demonstrations of this effect with sounds. They observed the auditory attentional blink effect using simple tones, spoken letters and digits, and spoken syllables. As you see in the table right here, we also knew that there is plenty of evidence for the neural and cognitive similarities in the perception of human faces and voices. In the empirical studies which formed the 3 papers presented in this thesis, I tested the potential modulations of auditory attention and perception to fill some of these gaps in the literature. We have already seen some instances where we blink to sounds, but are there some stimuli that doesn't show this effect? I predicted that a likely candidate was human voices based on the similarities between faces and voices, as well as the attentional blink findings for the face stimuli. So a key question in my thesis concerned, can human voices surpass the limits of attention and perception? In addition, I wondered what could explain the potential individual differences in the auditory modality. For example, could there be a musicality advantage in the limits of attention and perception? Here's an outline of what you would find in my thesis. So structurally, the thesis is divided into 2 halves. The first chapter is an introductory chapter of the thesis. The first part is the introductory chapters of the thesis, and it has 6 chapters binding different aspects of the thesis together. The first chapter introduces the topic as well as the objectives of the thesis, the research questions, and the scope of the thesis. In the second chapter, I present an overview of the literature on voice processing using evolutionary and neuroscientific perspectives. In chapter 3, I covered the studies and debates on temporal limits of attention and presented various evidence to suggest how it may be possible to overcome these limits in detail. The fourth chapter is an extensive methodology chapter detailing and critically reflecting on the measures, experimental methods, and the 2 statistical approaches used in this thesis. Chapter 5 summarizes each empirical study with their key findings. Here I also presented open questions that arose from each investigation to explain how these informed the following investigations in the thesis. Finally, in the final chapter, I discuss and integrate the findings of the thesis and propose directions for future research. In the second half of the thesis, there is the 3 empirical papers. I'll briefly introduce them in a bit. In my thesis, I asked 3 main questions. The first one was related to the stimulus factors, and it was, can stimulus-related factors modulate the limits of auditory selective attention and perception? To answer this question, target sound category, the duration of the sounds, the proximity between the 2 targets, or lag, was experimentally manipulated. This question was central to my thesis. Many important sub-questions arose from this main question. For example, the ones related to the human voice. The second question was about the participant factors. And here I asked, What are some of the participant-related factors that can modulate the limits of auditory attention and perception? You can imagine that there are many potential factors that could be explored here. We selected a few of them based on previous findings and our predictions. These were musicality, expertise, working memory capacity, and impulsivity. This question had a secondary role in the investigations. Finally, this thesis also asked a methodological question, which was, can psychophysiological measure of mental effort throw light on the limits of auditory selective attention? To index mental effort, we used pupillometry, which measures the changes in the eye's pupil. This method was used in addition to the behavioral measures. I will now briefly present each of the empirical investigations in this thesis. So the first paper was on the auditory attentional blink effect for voices and objects of expertise. It essentially asked this: can expertise with voices and with tones related to one's musical expertise modulate temporal limits of auditory attention? The final sample included 36 participants. Half of the participants were professional cellists and the other half were non-musicians. Their task in the experiment was to perform an auditory variant of the attentional blink task. They were presented with a rapid stream of various environmental sounds, each lasting for 150 milliseconds. Among these, there was also either one or two target sounds. At the end of each stream, the participants were asked to report the identity of the first target, which was either a sine tone or a white noise, and then to report whether the second target was present or absent. One critical manipulation here was the second target type, which could be either a human voice, a cello tone, or an organ tone, presented in different experimental blocks. So 3 key findings emerged from this experiment. Here we found that human voices, when presented as the second targets, were the least likely to show an auditory attentional blink effect. And this was independent of the participants' music expertise. Attentional benefits with human voices did not seem to extend to cello second targets, despite their assumed perceptual similarity to voices. And this was shown with the group differences between the musicians and the non-musicians' scores. Auditory attentional blink was less likely to occur among expert cellists than the novices. So these results indicated that attending to voices can be special for human listeners. This paper is published in Frontiers in Psychology. The second paper was about recognition of brief sounds. The main idea was to test different sound durations in a similar rapid recognition task outside of the auditory attentional blink paradigm. The research questions concerned when searching among other sounds, are certain sounds, for example, human voices, recognized at shorter durations than other sounds? And also we asked, is musical sophistication and working memory related to individuals' auditory recognition performance? Here the data was obtained from 48 participants, and we tested detections of brief target stimuli, which could include sine tone, bell, human voice, or cello targets. And we tested sound durations of 150 milliseconds, 120 milliseconds, 90, 60, and 30 milliseconds. And in this study, we found that the recognition performance was overall high, showing that people can recognize predefined sounds among rapidly presented environmental sounds remarkably well. Overall, target recognition significantly impaired at 30 milliseconds, with the exception of recognition for human voices and sign tone targets. Further analysis suggested that the acoustic differences can explain the results of the sign tone, but not of the voices, again providing some evidence for human voices to be special in the way that humans recognize them. Finally, musical sophistication had a critical role in recognition performance at the shortest duration condition. This paper is resubmitted to PLOS ONE with our revisions. The third and final paper of this thesis was again about the auditory attentional blink, but this time combined with pupillometry. Here we wanted to replicate the main finding of first paper, which was the observation of a human voice advantage in the attentional blink task. We also aimed to reveal the attentional mechanisms and the intensity of attention during the attentional blink. So essentially, I constructed the task in paper 1, then deconstructed it in paper 2, and here we are really putting the pieces back together again. In this study, we had 56 participants. The task was similar to the one in the first paper, with some adjustments. The critical targets were human voices, cello tones, and dog barks. Dog barks were tested since we couldn't rule out any familiarity explanations of the voice advantage observed in the previous experiments. But this time, we wanted to include another sound category that is also biological and familiar to humans. In difference from the first experiment, this time we presented the sounds in 2 briefer durations, 30 milliseconds and 90 milliseconds. So the pupillary analysis appeared in this thesis was baseline corrected trial evoked pupillary averages. After the thesis submission, we have additionally conducted analysis on the T2, the second target evoked pupillary responses. So now I will present the new and updated findings. We found that, again, human voices were the least likely to show the auditory attentional blink effect. We also found some evidence to suggest that they may require less intense allocation of attention compared to the other auditory stimuli. And we observed smaller pupil dilations at the short lag, so when the second target followed the first target closely after, reflecting lower attentional processing in the window that attentional blink typically occurs. This paper is now accepted to Brain and Cognition. So 3 main findings of the thesis are as follows. First, sound category can modulate the limits of auditory attention and perception, but its interplay with the stimulus duration seemed to be critical. We found evidence for human voice advantage in the attentional blink studies with 150 and 90 millisecond conditions. The second finding was the modulations through participant-related factors need further investigation. Here we had either mixed and or inconclusive evidence. Finally, pupillometry was useful to reveal the cognitive effort associated with the allocation of attention to brief sounds. Pupil data provided additional insights into what was happening behind the scenes of a behavioral effect. Here are my concluding remarks. So it seems that human voices can afford an advantage for attentional selection. This is likely due to their evolutionary significance rooted in our neural architecture. This thesis showed, in addition to vision, in the auditory modality too, the modulations of the attentional limits are possible. For the stimulus-related factors, it was indeed possible, as shown by the human voice and the duration results. For the participant-related factors, there was no clear answer. The take-home message that I would like to leave you with is that attention is a limited resource, yes, but the context matters. Thank you. And thank you to the supervisors and the committee and the funders and the university, the center. Yeah, thanks.
I would like to thank the candidate for her introduction. We are going to take a break now and continue at 1 o'clock. Please be seated. Thank you very much and welcome back, everyone. I now call upon the first opponent, Professor Marie Tervaniemi, to come forward, please.
First, we make a sound check. I think everything is fine. Thank you. So thanks for the university. Thanks for Ritmo for inviting me to be here as the opponent, for having a discussion, dialogue, and discourse with the PhD candidate Merve Akça. We will have plenty to discuss. I appreciate your work a lot. And I start this discussion by asking about the choice of your topic. The topic and title is about attention in auditory modality, title being Attending to Sounds in the Blink of an Eye. Was it an easy choice of the topic?
Yeah, the topic sort of came out of identification of the gap in the literature. So it actually started with the attentional blink paradigm and why it was not so well studied in the auditory modality. So it evolved from there and from my readings and sort of found its direction. And as for the title, yeah, the blink of the eye part is sort of like a throwback to both to the paradigm and also to the second paper's the third paper's methodology on the pupillometry. So it's a wordplay in a sense.
Yes. And I got to know that this thesis is part of the Faculty of Humanities and Department of Musicology, and as part of Ritmo. But for me, having background in psychology, cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and so forth, this also sounds very psychological. Would you like to comment upon that?
Yeah, well, that's, I guess it comes from my background. I'm trained as a psychologist. Both my bachelor's training and master's training have been in the Department of Psychology, and I truly enjoy the cognitive aspects of human psychology, and so it sort of comes from that direction. Is a bit, I mean, to find my place in the interdisciplinary science is, I would say that my contributions are mostly coming from the psychology side, so therefore it's, I guess, it shows in the work that I produce as well, even though the topic itself can be studied in very many different ways. My interpretation is a bit from more from the psychology side, but I think it would be interesting for many who aren't necessarily psychologists themselves.
And that will be part of the discussion today, to find the framework which indeed is very much interdisciplinary, and also in terms of methodologies, it's very wide. And that will be the next question or topic for discussion. How would you describe your methods you have chosen to be used in your thesis if you think a continuum from perceptual auditory functions and cognitive auditory functions? Majority of your methods came from a behavioral side, but how about the continuum?
Yeah, I used behavioral methods, as you say, and of course this is not the only way that can be studied with these. The topic itself is possible to study with neuroimaging techniques and other ways as well. It's possible to study this in, not only restricting to behavioral methods, sure. As for the choice, I suppose it came about like this because of not being studied so well. I wanted to first demonstrate it in the behavioral ways, because this is indeed a behavioral observation, especially the attentional link is the big chunk of the work, right? And that's a behavioral phenomenon after all. So if we can't show it in behavioral ways, is a bit out of place, if that makes sense. So I think that the order should go this way, and that's why I focused on the behavioral ways to begin with, at least. But as you see in the third paper, we moved on to more psychophysiological measures with the pupillometry, and the ambition was also to do an EEG extension of this, but that didn't make the cut because of the time limitations and so on. But absolutely, it's possible to move forward from the behavioral to more physiological measures as well.
Yeah. But how about if you think this continuum from perceptual, sensory kind of phenomena and then cognitive phenomena? Where are you in that continuum? Or the phenomenon of attentional blink as such?
Yeah. The phenomenon itself is known as a cognitive phenomenon, and it's from connecting to the trial lecture again, it's more on the EEG studies have shown that it's more the late selection, the attentional blink reflects more the late selection aspect of it. But because of the way that I study is inseparable from the perception, and that's why I'm continuously referring to as temporal limits of attention and perception, because I think it's hard to separate in the context that I study, especially with the methods that I use. We can't really separate from the behavioral result. We can't really separate these two so well, and also because of the manipulations, the nature of the manipulations is a bit because of the salience aspect of the voice and so on. It's hard to separate the perception from the top-down influences of the phenomenon itself. So from in the spectrum, I think it's still somewhere in the middle, but a bit more closer to the cognitive part, I would say.
That was also my assumption when reading, but I was looking forward to hear your viewpoints upon that. The answer and the whole study paradigm would be probably different if you, for instance, had variation in the targets. So that now it was identification. But if it was, for instance, discrimination of if the pitch of the sound is the same or is the dog. sound the same as usual or something like combining MMN paradigm and then this kind of identification paradigm, then it would go towards the cognitive end, in my view. But I don't think that kind of study has been done yet. How about pupillometry? Would you categorize that as a behavioral only, or neuroscientific, or in your slides you had psychophysiological terminology being used? How would you describe that in more detail?
Yeah, I would still say it's a psychophysiological measure. It relates to the internal state of the people, and it's of course it's a behavioral observation as well in itself. But I think it's more than that, because we, as we also showed in that third paper, and many others, of course, before me, have shown that the pupillometry is telling more than the behavioral response. So in that sense, I would still put it more in the, not necessarily classify as the behavioral method, but more psychophysiological measure.
And in your thesis, you used the term indirect measure of brain activity. So I think that's pretty good descriptor of that. But how about if somebody comes to say that, okay, you have done eye tracking in your thesis? What would you say?
I would say no. I used the same technology that we can do, the gaze pattern tracking. Is the same. The eye tracking measurement device is what we're essentially using for measuring the size of the pupil. But yeah, eye tracking methodology can do more than pupillometry. Pupillometry is, it comes with the data that we collect when observing the eye movements. So it actually has both the data, but for us it's not informative to use the gaze patterns, because there isn't anything to necessarily track or watch in the screen. It's purely auditory study. So, but if one is interested in combining two modalities, for example, or for some reason if one is interested in still seeing the eye movements, even when there's nothing to watch, of course it can be looked into, and maybe there will be something interesting there too.
Maybe there's somebody in the audience, either in this room or in the YouTube, who would like to know more about eye tracking. In which kind of paradigms you consider eye tracking, the gaze measures, as useful? If we now ignore this attentional blink paradigm.
Visual tracking, visual search, that's the most, I would say that's the most useful. Like complex search, visual search tasks. There is a complex visual scene, like this Beres-Waldo kind of search. That's also an attention task in itself. So there it would be useful. Also in relation to music and music performance, it would be useful to, we've done it with, we had this workshop a couple of years ago, and we had, as a small part of it, we made participants watch musicians perform in a video, and there we could look into both the gaze patterns, so where the participant is looking during watching this string quartet perform, and also looked into the pupil dilations as well. So it can be studied multimodal context in this way, for example.
And for instance, in score reading, how that's learned, and as well text reading. So those have been the traditional contexts, but of course that kind of naturalistic contexts are more modern. So eye tracking is very useful, but as sub-part of that, I think pupillometry has, for instance, here been excellent choice as a method. What could you think of being the smallest children who could be studied with pupillometry? With many other brain research method, that's an issue, that not all of them are not applicable with young participants.
I haven't really thought about it, but spontaneously it feels like as long as they have some sort of inhibition, like inhibitory control is possible, because they have to not move so much to get an accurate measure. Yeah. So I guess that's maybe the criterion.
I would say that toddlers have been investigated in some occasions. Yeah. Yes. So it's quite cool. Applicable also with children. And I follow the line of my questions, even though you already answered to my next question. If you had more time, what would have been the next step in terms of using possibly some brain research methods? Yeah. What kind of measures? You said already EEG. Yeah. What kind of EEG you had in mind? What kind of
ERP? Because EEG because of the temporal resolution. Because this is a rapid, it's a rapid task, so it's important to be able to capture this kind of rapid changes. So in that sense, I would say EEG is a useful method, and within that, ERP's mismatch negativity could be used if task is changed a bit, and if we use these targets, in this case, human voice, for example, as a distractor instead. So it's sort of hidden target. If they weren't attending to it, or if they weren't instructed to attend to it, it could be useful, I think. But the directions of this is so many exciting directions, I think, that can come out of this, even though it seems like it's a very narrow topic. I'm fascinated to see how much one can apply the insights that came out of this to very many different directions.
I think that was a very good description of research process in general. So that first there's something quite broad, and then you narrow down, because that must be done in order to do something. So one paper, one publication, series of publications, but then you suddenly notice that, oh my God, this is so much more, and there are infinite number of studies to be done, for instance, upon this topic alone, even without broadening the scope of methods, but taking that possibility also into account. It's how it should go, actually. About my list of questions or topics for discussion, most of them are something directly from your thesis, something you have written already. Just to reiterate those topics further, and also maybe there are some people in the audience who haven't read it all. But I have one question, broad topic actually, about something mentioned in the thesis, but for good reasons not explained in the thesis, and that is the number of brain research methods that exist. So you, in a very elegant manner, introduced some findings, but you always just told this has been done with event-related potentials, this has been done with functional MRI, but you didn't start explaining what are ERPs and what is functional magnetic resonance imaging all about, and so. And now it's time to go to that. And it's a broad topic, and I have limited it so that I wish you to elaborate a bit about EEG, MEG, fMRI, and PET. And you can start off thinking them in terms of their temporal resolution and spatial resolution. And while you are thinking how to proceed, I tell you in the audience, you can now inhibit your attention. What happened in late 90s when I was visiting the research group of Professor John Sloboda in Kiel University. At that time, we had already started to use these EEG, MEG, and so forth, but because the knowledge was not spread among music psychologists, I started my visiting lecture by introducing them all. I had something like 60 minutes, and I'm afraid that I used quite a lot of time in introducing the methods. Then I went on to introduce the findings, and then when 60 or 70 minutes were gone, then one person in the audience said that, okay, to follow our tradition after these visiting lectures, now it's time to go to the pub. Oh, sorry, PUB. If you know Richard Parncutt, you know what I'm talking about. So, please, any of these four in terms of spatial, temporal and spatial resolution.
Yeah.
You can define the order.
Yeah. Well, EEG is short for electroencephalography, and this one has the highest temporal resolution, I think, and fMRI is more used for because of its spatial resolution, and fMRI is short for magnetic resolution imaging, functional magnetic resolution imaging, and this is a bit more, this is more of taking the image of the brain, so it's more about identifying different areas that are lit during the different brain activities, whereas EEG is a method that we use more to see the sensitivity of brain response, and it's more related to temporal questions, as I said, because of the temporal resolution. And PET is also another imaging technique. Topography. I'm very bad with this.
Positron emission tomography.
Positron emission topography, yes. And that's also giving quite detailed pictures of the brain, and it's a bit more costly, I think, if I remember correctly. And what did I say? MEG.
Magnetoencephalography, yes. And that's the sibling or cousin of EEG, because whenever there's electrical field created in the brain, there's also magnetic field around it. So the temporal resolution is actually the same than with EEG. But talking about costs,
more costs.
EEG is something like 5,000 euros, and MEG is about 1 million euros. So that makes a difference. How about the difference between EEG and MEG together, and fMRI and PET together regarding the brain mechanisms they reflect? So if we think that in EEG there's this electrical activity which is measured, what would you say about the imaging methods?
What would I say?
About imaging methods, so fMRI and PET. What are the brain mechanisms behind it?
Yeah, that's more, the areas involved in different activities. So like when we're doing some task, or which areas are active during doing something. It's more related to that.
Yes, so those methods are good in showing the origin of the activity, because one can map the hemodynamic responses of the brain based on oxygen consumption, for instance, in functional MRI, while in EEG and MEG we only can indirectly compute the source of the activity. So that's kind of, computationally it's possible, but it's less accurate. So if we summarize, EEG and MEG are temporally very good, and the others are spatially very good. So you were really on the right track, and also in terms of the costs. What I would like to mention in this context is that even though positron emission tomography, PET, hasn't been used recently too much because it always has radioactive labels, it has very big benefit over fMRI because it's silent. And in fMRI, there's always acoustic noise created by the scanner. And that is in music-related or auditory-related studies that might be considered as less optimal choice, but it's modern method and a lot in use. How about if we think participants in these different experiments? I already mentioned briefly about the child participants, but even adult participants. If you think somebody going to scanner or somebody going to EEG, what would be the participants' viewpoint in that kind of situation?
Right, I guess you mean like, is it intrusive? And I would say they aren't. So for the EEG, from the participants' point of view, what's being done? I guess the least comfortable part is washing the hair part, or at least I've been told by some participants back during my bachelor's. So you basically have to have a clean scalp, and you put the cap on the participant's head, and it has a bunch of electrodes attached to it, and you start putting the liquid to make the activity for it to, what's the word that I'm looking for?
Impedance.
Yeah.
So that electricity is well perceived by the electrodes.
Yeah. So from participants' point of view, it's not so intrusive in that sense. It's just wearing a cap and some reference electrode attached usually to ear, and then you perform the task basically. And for the fMRI, it might be a bit more different experience, I guess, because there are some things that should be taken into account, like you can't have any metal object on your body. That includes also like on the teeth and so on, for example, or piercings for that matter. So a bit more like one needs to be a bit more mindful of these kind of things because it's a very heavy magnetic field in the scanner. So the participant goes into the scanner, and if they have claustrophobia, for example, it might be difficult for those kind of participants. So I would say that it's easy from the participants' point of view. Maybe it's easier or less, even though both are not intrusive. I would say maybe EEG is a bit more participant-friendly, if I may say so like that.
Let's take again the child participants' viewpoint. So for children, it would be quite difficult to be in the tube, in the scanner for a while without moving or saying anything. But with EEG, one can be even standing or sitting, moving slightly. All movements are causing artifacts to EEG, but those can be removed afterwards. Yeah. So for many studies, EEG might be more participant-friendly, but sometimes fMRI is the only option, and then there are very good practices to deal with even some participants who feel beforehand that it's not necessarily comfortable, but they get used to that little by little. So both methods are completely safe, for sure.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. Now we move on to completely different planet. We go to definitions of very broad issues, and the first of them is attention. It can't be bigger topic than that. You use the temporal selective attention as your conceptual framework, but what kind of other attentions or labels of attentional functions you might give us.
Well, this is a very big topic, as you say, because I didn't want to use that quote, that heavily cited quote by William James. Everyone knows what attention is. It starts with. So this sort of and this definition has been around for quite some time, and it's sort of is still being used because it has some points that is still applicable. And so attention, the definition of attention, I think is hard, or definitions for that matter, I think is in general hard, especially if we're talking about relatively abstract concepts or any cognitive function is hard to define. And it's not just me that struggles with it. I think it's most psychologists are finding this a bit of a tricky thing to deal with. I always give this example of the so-called toothbrush problem, because everyone wants to have their own, and nobody wants to use someone else's. So that applies to attention, definitions of attention as well. So everyone comes up with their own definition, and it's hard to reach to a set definition of these concepts. So that's where I'm standing, at least. So that's why I was sort of avoiding this definition part in the thesis overall. I don't know if you noticed. Yeah. I mean, the reason why I focused on this aspect and defined only temporal, or maybe I defined only selective attention actually, is because I think attention is such a broad concept, and it's not limited to only the selective aspects either, although even though it's mostly used in the selective aspects of it, or at least the way in this thesis is only the selective aspects of attention that has been discussed. But there are many different aspects of attention that can be studied and is being studied, and these are separated into different categories. I mentioned, for example, divided attention in the trial lecture.
And involuntary attention.
Involuntary attention, exogenous attention, and
so I think this already tells that attention as such is, as you said, it's impossible to define, but it is defined through the sub-processes or kind of subcategories, which one is using in one's own studies. And that tells something about science, that we might think that science is objective and same to all, but it isn't. I will go even deeper, and I will make your life now even more complicated. How about connection or relationship between working memory? If we think what is in the spotlight of attention and what we think is in the processes of working memory. Can you make any difference between them?
Yeah. It's hard. Yeah.
And I don't think it hasn't been done in the literature either, because the literature for working memory studies is completely different from that of attention. So people, they stay in their own frameworks and they are happy. But if one goes beyond or above the frameworks, then life gets complicated. And I won't complicate your life further. But just as an example, how difficult theoretical concepts we are dealing with in daily life. So it's amazing when we stop and start thinking. Even though thinking makes sometimes headache, but sometimes it must be done. The last one in this row of difficult concepts is personality.
It gets harder and harder, I feel like.
That's the last one. How would you define personality, and how did you operationalize personality in your studies?
Yeah. I haven't really talked about how I would define personality before.
That was in one of your boxes.
No. I mentioned, so in the thesis I mentioned, I have this section of the definitions where I basically offer definitions of the few concepts only, and restricting only to how they're studied in this thesis, like the narrowed down versions of the bigger concepts, and also how they are defined in these investigations. So personality wasn't one of them. And in terms of personality, I suppose the only thing that we have here is impulsivity. So I would sneak into that path and just focus on the impulsivity part, because personality, it can be anything, right? And it's usually measured with these like the big scales, like Big Five, and which is basically like it categorizes certain traits, personality traits, and these are of course validated and commonly used scales. And impulsivity is one of the traits that I have in the thesis, and that's more about how people are basically making. It's a little bit related to decision making in a sense, I would say, and also related to inhibition, inhibitory control. So if one is making more impulsive choices, is this more like, and it's also in the scale that I use. I want to highlight this because I think it's very important to make this distinction that when I define something, or when some other researcher defines something, what they're actually defining is how they measured it, or I think it should be like that. That if I'm defining a concept, I can only talk about in relation to the measurement. So in this case, impulsivity is what I looked into. It's not the broad concept of personality. So I don't dare talking about the broad concept of personality because of that. And impulsivity was measured with one scale, inventory, which differentiates impulsivity into two categories. One is dysfunctional and the other is functional. So one is basically when it doesn't serve the person well in everyday life, and the other aspect is more related to when it does work better for this person. I don't know if it answers.
It was an excellent answer, because exactly like you said, you can talk about what you have measured.
Yeah.
But of course, to go beyond that, I would like to know your opinion about this impulsivity and openness factor in Big Five, because according to many views, Big Five is the measure of personality. For me, it sounds a bit similar, impulsivity and openness to new experiences and so forth, but would you agree?
Maybe to the functional part, I would say, because I think openness is a bit more understood as a more positive trait. I would say that the dysfunctional part is maybe where it's going a bit different direction. And openness might have more relation to the experience part, like experiencing things, whereas the impulsivity is more related to response choices. So in that sense, there are some differences, but I can see why you think that they're similar, and yeah.
But I also think that your measure was very good in your study context with the pupillometry and so forth. Yeah. And if the study was more about personality, I would go on and start discussing about the stability of personality characteristics. If somebody is, let's say, open to new experiences when he or she is in 30s, whether it remains until this person is in his or 50s, and so forth. And also how individual or how context dependent is personality actually. Whether the same factors pop out in Finns or in Americans, Norwegians, and so forth. So how much these issues are socially determined as well. But your thesis is not about personality, so we move on. In one of your studies, you had musicians as your participants, and we move to that topic next. And there, in some parts of the text, you defined musicians and auditory experts. And I really like this definition because it has many aspects of musicianship. But how about those auditory experts who are not musicians? Like sound producers or DJs or audio technicians or so, who in many cases they have background as an amateur or even semi-professional musicians, but it is not necessary to be so. They can also be just so very experts with their hearing. Would you count these participants, for instance, to be good participants for your next studies?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree that they are also auditory experts and they should be treated as such. And we have thought about this in this study, and I actually had added, so we used the GOLD SMI index for measuring musical sophistication in addition to these experts. There's other criteria of defining the musical experts, which was basically being a professional musician, and they were like very highly trained. They had like, I think, average 20 years of training in music, or maybe even their own instrument. I can't be certain about it right now, but yeah, they were certainly in that expert group. But yeah, what I was saying was that in that questionnaire, there isn't any question about these other types of auditory experts. And I have noticed that, and I added one of the additional questions in that questionnaire was that if they have any other training in any of the other auditory domains. And in parentheses, we have defined like something like, yeah, auditory, sound engineering. I don't remember what else we put in the parentheses, but yeah, it was asked, and there was only one participant that had that kind of background, but that was in addition to the musicianship background, so it was in the musician group still. But yeah, we didn't have that kind of participant in the novice group, and that was intentional, and that's because I think they're also experts. It's just it comes from related but a little bit different training background.
So literature also in this respect is sometimes kind of fluctuating. For instance, for many years, if there was a study about musicians, it always meant instrumental musicians. And as an amateur singer myself, I thought that, singers are also musicians. And nowadays, singers are counted.
Yeah.
Because singing also involves motor practice, even though it's not visible like with piano playing or cello playing, but it's anyway some kind of training with voice production. But another issue which is really discrepant in the literature is how you define professional musician or anything like that in terms of the duration of the training. And now I read a couple of examples from your thesis. Somebody had classified as a musician those somebody who played musical instruments for at least 4 years and actively played a minimum of 4 hours a week. Then somebody else classified as a beginner or intermediate person, somebody who had 2 to 8 years of training in music, and advanced level musician 12 to 25 years of training. And the third study, musicianship, was defined in terms of either having 7 hours of weekly instrumental practice in the course of the last 3+ years, or something and something and something. Mm-hmm. So tell us, what was your decision in this respect?
Yeah, so this is a problem, I think, in these kind of comparisons, that it's really dependent on the recruitment or the selection criterion for who counts as musician or who counts as different categories of musicianship can also be, right, as you were describing, like who is amateur, who is professional, and so on. Like there are so many different ways of making these divisions in different. So this is where I sort of started thinking, wait a second, what's happening here? And like I looked into quite a bit, like how different researchers are defining who counts as musician and who doesn't make the cut. And there is no set answer, but there was one review article, I think, that also had the same concern as us. And in that study, they sort of came to the conclusion that usually researchers set the definition of the musician with minimum 5 years of the formal training, and some are also including the, in addition to the training, it's also the practice aspect. So this can be how many hours they play weekly, and so there are different ways to make this kind of decisions, which I think is a bit troublesome, because how do we then look into, like, when we say musicality benefits, who are we counting as the musician here? It is quite relevant. So I would recommend for anyone who is reading these kind of studies and reaching certain conclusions about the differences between musicians and the non-musicians to look into what was the criterion for defining this group of participants as musicians.
And how was your solution? What was your decision?
Yeah, so in the first study, I compared experts, because that was also, like in general, related to the bigger question of the objects of expertise. So we had to have the experts from the beginning. So in that study, there was the division of expert musicians and non-musicians. And experts were, I think, read from here how I defined musical expertise in that study, was advanced level of music performance experience combined with extensive training in music. So it could come from either, being a professional with a performance experience, and in addition the extensive training. So it had two components basically. But we also asked participants who aren't classifying or who aren't making the cut, so to say, and defining themselves as non-musicians to also do the musical sophistication questionnaire, which then follows in the rest of my thesis as well, even when there isn't a categorical division of musicians and non-musicians. This way, musicality in the rest of the thesis, and actually starting also a little bit with the first study as well, is being treated as more as a spectrum and not as necessarily as that strict division of two categories of people. And that's, of course, a choice. And I wasn't there from the beginning, so when I started my PhD, I wasn't necessarily thinking this way, but while reading the studies and seeing like different ways of studying this concept of musicality, I sort of had a little bit of change of heart in this respect and started seeing musicality more as a generic capacity that exists within all of us, but for some that are experts or better than the average, let's say, they have the additional training aspects and the practice, and so much is going on. Of course, it's not to say that we're all equal in that matter, but it's more like a spectrum. The way I see it, it's not black and white.
And there are many opinions or new viewpoints in the field who really ask for this kind of continuum thinking also in terms of statistical analysis, so that it wouldn't be categories for this and this and this kind of participants, for instance, based on their musicality scores, but it would be a continuum which is then taken into account in statistical models. It makes modeling more difficult, but it would be closer to real life, probably. So you are exactly in the right track. Next we go to the figure number 3.1 in your thesis, which I found extremely thought-provoking. It's about the number of publications coming from visual attentional blink and auditory attentional blink. Excellent idea to go to see prior literature, because one of the assessment criteria often for PhD thesis is whether it brings new knowledge to the field. So what would be your own assessment based on this figure and the discussions by now?
Yeah, well, based on the figure, it looks like nobody cares about auditory attention, which is a bit strange, but it's, I mean, I think the problem here is that attentional blink is discovered, well, it's not a problem, maybe problem is the wrong word, but the core of the issue, is why auditory attentional blink is studied significantly less, I think could be that it's started in the visual modality, right? It was discovered in vision, so it's the paradigm is coming from vision, and it's easier to apply what has been discovered. And also a little bit, if I may speculate here, I think it could be also a little bit about the wording. Blink is something happening in the vision. It's hard to break the metaphors. And I think we scientists are falling into these traps a bit too often, that like once is associated with vision, maybe it's hard to think that, well, is it happening in other domains and so on. So it could be because of that, I guess, that it's studied less. In terms of my own topic, like what this graph shows, is basically for people who aren't seeing the figure, is what I've done here is basically that on Web of Science, between 2012 and 2021, number of publications, I contrasted the number of publications appearing with the search results of auditory attentional blink and visual attentional blink. And what you see in the graph is that auditory attentional blink is studied significantly less. And yeah, this sort of, I use this graph to highlight that the gap and why it's needed to study this phenomenon more, because it seems like we don't know that much about this phenomenon in this modality. And I mean, this is only the comparison of vision and audition, right? If you were to go to other modalities, then the picture is even worse. But I think it's not just about the attentional blink. It's usually like that for phenomenon or concepts that appeared in one modality than applied to other modalities. And its attention is more often studied with vision. So, and that, but yeah, in the trial lecture I tried to sort of cover that it wasn't always like that. From the beginning it didn't start like that, but it became that. And, but yeah, the auditory modality, it still has quite a lot of relevance to many other fields. So I think that even though it looks a bit like nobody cares, as I said, I think we should care about studying the visual phenomenon in the auditory modality as well.
And maybe to reach more ecological validity, then also cross-modal studies could be done, and so forth. So there's huge space for development of the paradigms. And that will be my last question, and that's related to figure 1.1. We seem to go backwards in the thesis now. And that is a beautiful schematic box illustration about the papers and about their variables and how they have been then defined. And there are 3 papers, and then there's an empty space. If we think that Santa Claus existed, and you could have the 4th study done, what would it be? It doesn't have to be EEG. It has been discussed already. It can be something bigger and wilder. And you have enormous resources. 5 years, all equipment.
Nice.
All participants.
Yeah.
What would it be?
Yeah, I am tempted to go clinical applications of these kind of from these informed from these findings. I think the most meaningful for me would be to go and apply these more with the clinical groups, because now we have discovered or found some evidence for a human voice advantage in healthy populations. And I am interested in voice, studying voice a bit more in depth. And I think an interesting question would be to study this kind of, not necessarily with attentional blink, I'm not sure about that part, but this, the findings of the voice findings in relation to clinical groups such as autism, autistic spectrum disorder, I think is very interesting, because we know that in, well, there are different theories for the dysfunction in autism, but the interesting part for me would be to look into the voice processing in this group, and that's because of the social communication aspect of voice. Is it the voice signal in itself, or is it the emotional aspect of the voice? Is it auditory? Because we also know that in this group of patients, we also have the auditory processing difficulties. So it's interesting to like combine these together. I have some ideas for it. So that would be, I think, the 4th big study for 5 years plus.
Okay, I wish you have time to write a letter to Santa Claus.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this discussion. I find the discussion fruitful. It wasn't a surprise to me because I enjoyed reading the thesis a lot. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tervaniemi, and also the candidate Merve Akça, for a lively dialogue. We're going to take a break now and meet again in about 15 minutes at 2:15. Welcome back, everyone. I now would like to call upon Professor Pascal Belin to take over from me, and I also would like to ask the candidate to come forward, please. The screen is yours, Professor Belin.
Hello?
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first, I want to thank you and the university and Ritmo for inviting me on your committee. And I'm sorry not to be able to be present physically. I want to first congratulate you for the quality of your manuscript, which was very well structured and with a clear review of the different relevant sections that were adequately summarized with all the key papers well summarized and illustrated. I found that it's also very good experimental work that forms a complementary set of studies. And again, congratulations for having made the effort to present this work in the form of 3 publishable or actually published papers, although I understand it's not a requirement of your faculty. Makes things much better. And well, congratulations for having published already 2 of these papers and having the 3rd one nearly published.
Thank you.
The other aspect I think must be recommended in your thesis was the effort to analyze the data both using the classical frequent list analysis strategy, but also Bayesian statistics, and having to deal with the potential mismatch between the two. But that's something that really we should see much more in research. I enjoyed your presentation this morning, but I must say I was a little bit disappointed not to have seen any of the actual data that you collected, rather summaries. I don't know if it's customary in Norway, but in France, typically the student goes through the data sets and shows the analyses that were performed. So I guess this part of your disputation is my opportunity to go back to the data and so that we can see a little bit together the different questions I had. So if you can go to the first figure of your first article. So it's on page 104 of your thesis manuscript. Okay, yeah, so the protocol, so what you actually ask the subjects to do, so there's this series of sounds, then there's the first target, and then at a variable lag, you have the second target, which could be voice, cello, or organ. So first, what motivated the choice of the different sound categories? Why did you use these 3 categories?
Yeah. You mean the second target categories,
Yeah.
right? Voice, cello, and organ. Yes. Well, the first part was the voice, because we were interested in looking into, as I mentioned, the core question was whether human voices can surpass the limits of auditory attention in this, as reflected in this attentional blink phenomenon. And this was based on the results from the face stimuli in the vision, and also the similarities shown by your work and some other people's work. So the choice of voice was because of that. And the cello was selected because of the perceptual similarities between voice and the cello. Of course, cello is not the only candidate that could be studied here.
What perceptual similarities?
What?
What are the perceptual similarities between voice and cello?
Like the cello is being perceived as more like voice-like than various other kinds of sounds. And the cello is not the only sound that sounds similar to voice, but the reason for choosing cello was not only the assumed similarity, but also the results from several neuroscience papers that showed overlap, neural overlap in voice and, or rather, string sound category showed like greater selectivity in the brain, and that was also found in the voice sounds. And in another study with the cellist, they also observed that in the cellist's brain also there was a neural overlap for cello sounds and the voice when they hear the cello and the voice. So these were sort of and the cello is playing two roles in this study. One is because of this similarity to voice, and the other is as an object of expertise for the cellist. I had easier access to the cellist participants. For example, if you were to select oboe, it would be harder for me to find oboe experts, whereas it was easier to find cello experts. So it sort of had double role in that sense. And organ was selected as a control sound. And we wanted to select something that is still familiar to people who aren't necessarily musicians in this study. And so they should have some familiarity with the sound so that they can recognize it. And organ was selected because of that. And also it was distinct from voice and the cello in terms of acoustics.
Okay. And so how many exemplars of these different categories did you present to the subjects in terms of to be representative of a category? Typically, you need several exemplars to kind of create kind of boundaries between different stimuli. So,
and if I remember correctly, it was 16 for each category, and I can just double check. Yeah, it's 16 excerpts for each of these categories.
Okay, and so when we use different categories, we want to control or match them on certain variables, but keep differences in others. So what did you try to do here? How are the stimuli similar? What are the acoustical parameters that you control across the stimuli, and what could be the remaining differences between these stimuli apart from voiceness?
Yeah. Well, they were represented in different pitches, and they all had the same pitches presented. So that was controlled, and their duration, all the sounds were matched in the duration, not just the targets, but also the environmental sounds, the distractors, and the target one. So everything was matched in duration, and how we normalized the sounds, which was all of them were normalized using peak normalization method. And,
okay, so that's a point I want to discuss with you, because indeed the normalization is important to try to minimize difference in perceived loudness between the stimuli that could attract the attention just irrespective of the timbre of the category, but simply because they are louder. So what is your view on the peak normalization in that respect versus RMS normalization, for example?
Yeah. So this was an early choice that we had to make in this study and the upcoming studies. So the motivation for choosing the peak method over RMS was that in one of the papers by Belin and colleagues, they specifically compared these two methods with the similar kind of stimuli. They also had musical instrument sounds and voice and environmental sounds, although the rest of the instruments, I'm not sure if organ was there, but the important part is that human voice advantage only appeared when they used the RMS normalization method and not when they used the peak normalization method. So this finding was the reasoning behind not going, even though it's more common to use RMS normalization, we chose the peak normalization method because otherwise any kind of human voice advantage could have been explained by choosing the RMS method. So that was the main reason for going for the peak normalization.
Okay, thanks. How do you interpret that difference that Belin and colleagues found between RMS and peak normalization? What do you think is the cause?
They argued in the paper that if there would be no difference, that would show that that would be support for a modular detection of voices. And if there would be a difference in these two methods, then it would be evidence in support of more perceptual, general perceptual differences in the voice advantage. So that was their interpretation. Of course, it's just one study. It's hard to draw too much conclusions from it. But yeah, that was the conclusion that was drawn from there, that the voice advantage in the literature could reflect using the RMS normalization method is their argument.
Okay, we'll come back to that for the second paper. Now, in terms of the paradigm, if you can go back up on the figure of your rapid serial presentation paradigm. Oops, sorry, down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go.
So there's, in terms of temporal constraints, because this is what you want to manipulate, primarily there's two different things you can manipulate. One is the rate of presentation, and the other one is also the duration, as you did. What led you to this choice of rates and duration?
In the context of this study, right?
Yes, why did you choose those particular durations and rates?
Yeah, this was also another early decision in this study because, as I mentioned in the audit, there isn't that many of the auditory explorations. We lost the video of you. Now we're back.
Sorry.
So there wasn't that many auditory studies. So I actually could. This is both a negative thing and a positive thing. That on the positive side, I can go through literally almost everything that's published and look into the parameters that they have used. But as I mentioned, most of these studies used more simple tones. So some of those had shorter durations, whereas we wanted participants to make a bit more like they have to be categorized as this sound, like it belongs to this category, right? So based on that, I chose the longer duration that was tested in the literature. So 150 was tested because of that, and 10 milliseconds was enough to, when we heard it ourselves, it was also, by the way, interstimulus interval of 10 milliseconds was also used by some of the other papers, and also it it was still perceived as like separate entities, the sounds themselves. I mean, and if there will be longer silence in between the sounds, it would make the sounds appear it would be presented even slower, which we didn't want in this case because it's supposed to be a rapid paradigm after all. So that was the reasoning behind it. But as you've seen from the results, that this kind of setup didn't show any attentional blink in any of the categories. That's why we had to go to the Bayesian side of things, which I am guessing that you were getting to at the beginning as well. So that's why the next studies we sort of went to the duration and the presentation rate, because there's also papers on those that, especially in the vision, there was some discussions on this, whether certain presentation rates are providing the sweet spot for an attentional blink. In particular, in vision, 10 hertz rate, so 100 millisecond of stimulus onset asynchrony is the typical in the visual modality, but there's no such standard established right now in the auditory modality. So we had to test and see how it goes, basically.
Thank you. So maybe we can go to the figure 2 then, the results. Because there's two sides of the results in this paper. One is general advantage for voice over cello or organ, and the other is the question of the attentional blink. That is the difference between lag 3 and lag 9. So if we just ignore for a moment the difference between the lags, simply comparing the categories, and just ignore the experts, but look at the red curves, the novices, so people like you and me, or perhaps like the general population, there's clearly a nice effect of the category on the accuracy of detecting this sound. Most seem to be largely above chance, but there is a clear difference. Would you? Is the difference between organ and cello, is it significant? Because it seems that they perform like nearly 10% better for the organ than the cello. And how would you? I mean, was this something that you explained, that you expected?
Yeah, organ and cello contrast. I at the top of my mind, I can't remember. There was plenty of results, so I can take a look quickly. The group differences there was that I remember that the cellist performed better when the second target was cello, but you were asking about the novices. So
you mean? Oh yeah, they were better than the novices. Yeah, clearly we see. And then there is this big difference with the voice, where they perform, even the novices perform at 95%, irrespective of the lag.
Yeah.
So here you clearly show an advantage of voice. It's easier to detect a voice stimulus than these other targets.
Yes.
So this is a clear voice advantage, indeed. So what's your interpretation for this effect?
Yeah, well, as you say, that for voice targets, it was clear that both the novices and the expert musicians performed very high, and the musicians overall performed very high in all target types, which is not so surprising, perhaps, given that we discussed earlier also that they are auditory experts. And for the voice part, it's interesting.
But I'm sure that for the experts, you would have expected the performance in the organ, for which they have not been trained, to be lower, no?
Not necessarily. I mean, that was also one of the questions that was interesting for me to look into, if there's a trained instrument advantage also among the cellists. But it didn't really show here that, so it could be that they are like overall better in auditory tasks. That's one interpretation. Or it could be that the task wasn't difficult enough for experts to show this kind of effect. So if we somehow adjusted the task difficulty,
that was my next question, indeed. As you pointed out in the paper, there seems to be a strong ceiling effect, such that the difference in the performance is so high for all the timbres in the expert that it's very difficult to find significant differences, which is why comparing lag 3 to lag 9 or cello to organ is really underpowered. So in this condition, it's very difficult to evidence an effect, even if there is one.
Yeah.
So what's your suggestion on that?
Well, one suggestion is, as I said, to adjust the task to match the difficulty, to reflect these kind of differences that may arise in experts as well. Another is to instead of looking at expert musicians at this level of expertise, one could look into people who are more classified, or as we discussed, it's hard to cut these boundaries, but people who are less trained and see if there's effect there.
But even for the novices, you see a ceiling effect for the voice category.
Yes.
So perhaps indeed adjusting the level of difficulty to the expertise of each participant would be the right way to go. How would you do that?
Yeah, it's a difficult task, of course. I mean, one way to do it is to take the stimuli out of the paradigm completely and test recognition of all the sounds in isolation and see at what level it becomes more difficult to, they should still be able to do the task. They should still be able to classify the different sounds as what they are. But at the same time, if we can find that the rate or the stimulus duration, whatever makes the difference really, and take those as sort of course this is not, it's hard to make this at the individual difference level in this way, but it's one way to make the task a bit more difficult. In terms of personal adjustment, I suppose one could do, if we know that certain ways, if we can sort of manipulate the cognitive load in different ways, if we have 3 different conditions, let's say one low load and one medium load and one high load, and then we can, if the participant is making too much errors, then we can give the harder and easier, if that makes sense. As they progress we collect the data, we get the accuracy rate, and then they get stepwise getting easier or harder tasks load. I don't know.
Yeah, I see what you mean. This kind of adaptive tasks.
Yeah.
Without manipulating cognitive load, which is already quite demanded on for this kind of protocols where you have 2 targets to detect, duration of the stimulus could be a parameter that could be parametrically manipulated within individuals and assess their performance with a adaptive task that converge to a threshold, and then you use that duration for the participants. But yeah, I agree that's going much beyond this. But then potentially with shorter duration, actually, as you show in the 3rd paper, could make a difference.
Yeah.
All right, thanks. Let's move to the 2nd paper.
Yeah, so I can't show the second paper here because we only have the version that went to the library, and only the published paper can be in the library's online version. So I don't have the possibility to show on the screen the second and the third paper, but on the physical copies you can find them.
But for the sake of discussion, maybe we can just look at the figures that you showed in your manuscript.
Yeah, we don't have
If you don't mind.
available right now on the screen, but I have it, and everyone has physical copies, so it's fine.
Okay. So again, methodological questions. What motivated the choice of the stimuli in that second paper? Why did not use the same categories as the first?
The only difference was the bell targets, bell sound, and that was because in the first paper, or after the first study, we realized that the target one category, one of the target one categories, which was white noise, was found difficult for especially the non-musician participants. They couldn't really detect those targets that well. And of course, attentional blink is dependent on like how we measure attentional blink is T2 accuracy, given that T1 is correctly identified, right? So we want participants to be able to identify the first target well, so that we have enough data to go to the analysis. So if they couldn't identify the first target, those data is thrown. We can't measure attentional blink when they couldn't detect the first target. That's in the definition of attentional blink. So since they had trouble with the white noise, we wanted to change that to something else, and a candidate for that was the bell tones. So it's mainly like the second paper is testing out different durations and different target categories to set up the design of the third paper. So it's a little bit like forward plans here going on. So that's why bell got added here on the second paper.
Okay. And how about the sign tones?
Yeah, sign tones were present in the first paper as well. So that didn't change.
Okay, I missed that. Going back to the normalization, what effect do you think the choice of the peak normalization has had on the data, on the results that you obtained, considering the presence of the pure tones?
Yeah, of course, loudness is then perceived loudness would be better if we use the RMS, better controlled if we use the RMS method. So that's a trade-off that came with this choice. But there are ways to check this a posteriori as well. We didn't have time to do those analyses yet, but we've been looking into it, and A-weighting seems to be a possible way of analyzing these if there are perceived loudness differences coming from the stimuli.
Because clearly, if you have a pure tone in which all cycles have the same intensity, because it's a perfect sinusoid, versus a natural sound where there's a lot of cycle-to-cycle variability in amplitude, using the peak normalization, with the pure tones, it means that every cycle is at the maximum, compared to other natural sounds where only the most intense part would be at the maximum. So naturally, these drives, you can just check the RMS. You will have much more energy in the pure tones equalized by peak than with natural sounds, without even talking up how the brain perceives that in terms of perceived loudness, and indeed filtering with the human sensitivity curve might be useful. But here clearly the choice of the peak normalization explains for me the fact that the performance was much better for the pure tones than other categories.
Yeah.
In this data, what do you think?
Yeah, definitely. And we also looked into other acoustic differences that may arise in these different sound categories. So we selected some timbre-related spectral features, for example, spectral centroid, spectral spread, entropy, and brightness. We looked into those and compared all different categories, and we saw indeed that sine tones were differing the most from all sounds presented here, and all the others were in this. Of course, the largest group was the largest differences was among the environmental sounds, but they sort of overlapped. The other targets overlapped with the distractors. So the only one that was sticking out in terms of acoustic spectral features was the sine tones. So that explains why sine tones were recognized better, but it didn't explain the results obtained from the voices, only the sine tones.
Yes, you're right. So in terms of the voices, using the durations from 60 to 150 milliseconds in your first experiment doesn't seem to show any clear advantage of the voice in this context. No. Contrary to your first experiment, what's your interpretation?
Yeah. Well, in the first paper, what we're looking into is more related to attention, I would say, whereas here is more lower level detection. So it's slightly less cognitive task, I would say, or less demanding task in terms of cognition.
No, but I'm not talking about the attentional blink. Really, this simple detection task. You found a very clear advantage for voice in the first study. Here doesn't seem to show, at least not with durations longer than 60 milliseconds. Indeed, for 30 milliseconds, you see that difference?
Yeah, right.
How do you interpret that?
Right. So the voice advantage showed itself in the shortest duration, indeed. And that could be, for example, that's in a way what we were discussing earlier with adjusting the difficulty in terms of different aspects of the manipulations. So if we consider the duration manipulation as a change in the difficulty of the task, it could be that voice advantage showed itself when the task became more difficult. That's one way of thinking it. The other way could be that it's enough for voices. 30 milliseconds is enough for recognition, whereas for other sounds maybe it's not that easy. So those are my speculations.
Yeah. So I agree, and so clearly this advantage for voice seems to emerge really at very short durations, and we're talking 30 milliseconds. So in that particular study, what was your choice of voice stimuli compared to the other categories?
Yeah, it was in this study. It was female voice, mid pitch range. And it was with the sung vowel A in this study. So that's the description of it.
And for the cello, it was the same cello playing different notes, and same for the bells?
Yeah.
For the bells, it would have been different bells, I guess. And just getting to the fact that it seems that the same speaker singing at three different tones is not a very broad representation of the voice category. I wonder what would have happened if you had selected different speakers, for example, trying to maximize the variation in voice parameters.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one limitation of this study and the next study, that the acoustic set the sound set could have been more broad, and that would help us reach larger conclusions. Right now, I can only talk about the voice advantage within these parameters that we used here. If we want to make larger conclusions, it's best to use larger sets of all, in fact, not just voice, but for all categories, and just have more broader representation of all categories, especially voice.
I completely agree. But so nevertheless, you find a very clear advantage at this short duration with much better sensitivity to voice recognition, detection sensitivity to voice than to the other targets. So, I mean, 30 milliseconds is very short. Depending on the fundamental frequency of your signal, it's a handful of cycles of the waveform. What do you think is the information that is present in this very brief stimulus that explains this advantage? Or
yeah, that's a good question. Indeed, I was also surprised that this advantage appears already at this extremely brief duration. And from the starting point, if you go back thinking about the setup of the first study, with 150 milliseconds, I personally thought the task was hard. But I suppose, or at least from the comments that I received from the participants, once they're attending and in that zone, just with the headphones in a classroom, they get to the flow of this doing the task, and it was doable and it was fine. Both the pilot studies, so we didn't know, right, how they were gonna do. In the pilot also it was doable, so we went with it. And we still didn't know at this point in the second paper, before the results came, we didn't know really that how well participants would do. So we lowered the duration incrementally because of that. We didn't know necessarily that this advantage or we didn't know what we would find, and we didn't know that it would show itself in the 30 milliseconds. But you're right, in the 30 millisecond signal, there isn't that much, but it's still identifiable. And it's not, we lost the image. Are you there, Pascal? Maybe it's a connection issue.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry, we were cut.
Yeah, so I was saying that in the 30 millisecond there isn't maybe much. However, others have shown that when sounds were tested in isolation, it's not the same paradigm, but when they tested the sounds in isolation in these kind of categories, they could be categorized in 20 to 30 milliseconds for voices. And in another study, they even showed 2 to 3 milliseconds. So it's in that context, in the context of the literature, it's not that surprising that 30 milliseconds is enough.
But, yeah. Yeah, so my question was more, what can be detected in terms of the time? 5 cycles, or is very small to estimate properly the distribution of energy across the spectrum and to recognize, oh, this is a voice structure. So there has to be a kind of a template detector, something built in that is very robust to conspecific vocalizations.
Yeah.
Okay. Now for the third article, where you used pupil dilation as an index of cognitive effort. So first, it seems that you find finally an attentional blink for voice. So indeed, in some conditions with the right set of parameters, you can find this difference between lecture and advance. Lecture is different, beautiful difference that you have here, particularly again the short latencies. So very nice, and perhaps complementing well, I would say, the first study where you couldn't observe it. In terms of the pupil size, what was the hypothesis, and is it not a little bit surprising that the voice stimuli that are supposed to recruit better the attentional system gave rise actually to the smallest dilation values? Was it what you expected, or?
So with the new analysis that we did with the pupil results,
which I could not see. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So we after the thesis was submitted, we have updated the pupil analysis based on a suggestion from one of our reviewers. So instead of using the trial-evoked pupillary responses, so from the whole, instead of looking into the whole trials as average pupil responses, we focused on the pupil responses that arose after the T2, the second target's onset. So with those updated analysis, what we found was that in terms of the difference in terms of the previous results that you read is that so in the previous results, in the 30 millisecond condition, there was an increase from lag 3 to lag 9 for dog targets, which we wrote that it was surprising. That in the updated results, that effect was not observed, which made more sense, I think. And we also observed, so from the behavioral results, if we think back those, that the voices escaped the auditory attentional blink in the behavioral results, but not in the pupillary response. And so this sort of suggests that certain stimuli like voices can escape the attentional blink.
What do you mean escape?
So they didn't show the attentional blink.
But the data that I see, irrespective of the pupillary data, the mean T2 over T1 accuracy suggests a strong attentional blink for voices at 30 milliseconds duration. Or I misunderstood your... You clearly see that the accuracy is quite higher at lag 9 than lag 3 for 30 milliseconds duration. So evidence of a attentional blink for voices. Or I didn't understand.
No, maybe it's because of the figure, because the figure has the standard mean of the error, as they aren't confidence intervals. So in that, if we look at the accuracy, T2, T1 accuracy results, you'll see that there was no attentional blink in none of the categories in the 30 millisecond condition, but in the 90 millisecond condition, there was an attentional blink for cello and dog targets, but not for voices. So again, it sort of supported the same result that we got from the first paper with the 150 millisecond, but on the 90 millisecond condition.
I guess maybe it's lack of power, because there's clearly a very consistent trend across cello and voice at 30 milliseconds to show this increase in accuracy. So maybe it failed to reach significance, but certainly it's, I mean, I would have thought it would be significant, but okay. All right. Okay. Well, more generally, so you show across different experimental paradigms, different set of stimuli, that voice seems to have this attentional advantage, as if it were an attentional grabbing stimulus, privileging accessing attention resources. Why?
Yeah. Of course, there are possible arguments for this, and how I argued in this thesis was based on the evolutionary significance of human voices for humans. So, and I want to highlight this, that it's for humans. I don't claim that there is a human voice advantage for any organism. So it's more the conspecific voice advantage for conspecifics. So for us humans, it's an important signal that we perhaps carried with us because of its importance, evolution, and it carries a lot of meaning for us in many contexts, and it's the same for conspecifics as well. It's so it's very important for survival to begin with, because if we have, so even in other organisms we see that the voice and identification of voice, identification of the offspring and so on, it has quite a lot of relevance to survival and group living and many other things.
Yes, I agree. Perceiving accurately the richness of information contained in a specific localization has been part of the survival of the individual of the species across millions of years. But how do you think now, in terms of your human subjects, how does it translate to why do they show this advantage for us? How? What's the mechanisms? The neural mechanisms.
Yeah, it could be related to the voice selective areas in the brain, that voices are, the brain responds voices in a from a faster path, and it activates a certain region in the brain, as shown by studies, several studies, including studies that you've done. So that's one possible reason. And
yes,
another way could be that it's because of their salience, they're more like automatically detected voice targets.
Yeah, perhaps it's the same thing formulated in terms of results and in terms of mechanisms. Indeed, what we've been able to show is that processing the information contained in conspecific vocalizations, humans and other animals, recruits a large set of regions that seem to be dedicated for this sound category. And this additional bit of cortex, where there seems to be specifically activation of this large array of neural populations dedicated to one single sound category, clearly is a mechanistic explanation of what you find. And related to this and to the question of auditory expertise that was discussed, the first opponent, it seems that developing auditory expertise also develops neural networks in these STS regions where we find the voice selective areas, which would also explain why such auditory experts show this advantage for their expert category. So yes, I very much agree that this additional set of voice selective areas that we have, this additional toolkit of cortical regions dedicated to this single category, is largely explains these advantages, behavioral advantages for voice detection. All right, and finally, perhaps to take a little bit more context, you wanted to, your initial question was about the constraints and the temporal limit, and also what factors could you be used to modulate them. So what can we modulate in human voice to make it more attention-grabbing then?
Well, if we were to not use it in the context of attentional blink, then we don't necessarily have the restrictions of these short durations. So if we were to think of the voice as a more general, more ecological sense, then I suppose it could be, first of all, the meaning, so the semantics, and also the emotion aspect of what emotions are in the voice, right? And we saw also, like, from the if we once again think more in the evolutionary sense, what emotions are more what emotional voice would carry more significance to us, and that I could imagine, for example, more angry voices, more threat and fear-inducing sounds. So emotionally loaded sounds would definitely be attention-grabbing.
I completely agree. Parameters that you can manipulate with the voice, as you say, the semantic meaning, the linguistic meaning that necessarily unfolds over time, but even with brief stimuli, a brief affect burst expressing a very strong vocal emotion, this is a signal that we all respond to, like, instinctively, and because of this neural machinery. I'm pretty sure that using those kind of stimuli in an attentional blink experiment, more neutral voices, for example, would make a big difference. So yeah, I agree with you. But other parameters could be also manipulated: the gender of the speaker, the age, the personality impression that they give rise to. So the voice category offers a panel of different parameters that we can manipulate to, for example, know how best to manage them attention-grabbing in this context.
Yeah, and baby voices could also be, for example.
And baby voices, especially for young parents. All right, thanks very much for your answers. I think I'm done here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Belin and the candidate, for another lively dialogue. Is there anyone in the audience, either here in the room or online, who wishes to speak ex auditorio? It doesn't seem to be the case. On behalf of the Faculty of Humanities, I would like to thank both our opponents and the candidates and the evaluation committee as a whole for having carried out this disputation in a very motivating and intellectually rewarding way. And the proceedings are now over. We're going to send a report to the board of the University of Oslo. Hereby declare the proceedings concluded. Thank you very much all for attending.